Adrian Cole didn't believe in signs until the day a crying little girl sprinted past him with his late mother's gold pendant flashing on her chest. The same heirloom he'd lost 5 years ago, the last thing she'd ever fastened for him. When the necklace swung and the child hissed, "Don't touch, this is my daddy's," his world slammed to a stop, and everything he thought he knew about himself felt suddenly, terrifyingly wrong. If you're hooked already, don't miss what happens next. Please hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of this story. He swallowed the sudden sand in his throat and crouched to the girl's eye level, trading the commanding tone that moved markets for the softer cadence that calms frightened birds. "Hey, it's okay," he said, palms open, sleeves catching city dust. "I'm Adrian. What's your name?" The girl sniffed, wiped her face with the back of a small hand, and clutched the pendant like a lifeline. "Mira." Her voice trembled. "Mama's sick. I have to get the medicine." His driver had already pulled the Bentley to the curb, baffled. Bodyguards stiffened at a respectful distance, trained to view every stranger as a risk. But Adrian waved them back without looking. That necklace? AC? The Cole crest? The tiny nick near the clasp he'd traced 100 times while worrying impossible deals? Glittered against a faded t-shirt, out of place and perfectly right. "Let me help," he said gently, taking the crumpled prescription Mira held and scanning the shakily written drug names. "I'll have someone fetch these now, and I'll walk you home. We'll make sure your mom is okay." She stood frozen for a beat, weighing the offer with the wary math of a child who'd learned trust the hard way. Then her fingers loosened and slipped into his. They moved through a part of the city his charity galas discussed, but his shoes had never touched. Narrow lanes where sunlight slivered between rusted roofs, where laundry fluttered like prayer flags, where the afternoon smelled of soup pots and motor oil and ordinary bravery. Each jingle of the pendant was a hammer on an anvil inside his chest. He could have picked up the phone and solved a dozen corporate crises in a single call, but there was no shortcut to the small door Mira pointed at, no proxy for the moment it creaked open on a room with a thin mattress, a sweating woman, and the kind of quiet that knows worry by name. "Mama, I'm back," Mira whispered, already kneeling. The woman, Lila, tried to sit up and nearly folded on herself. Adrian crossed the floor in 3 strides, slid a pillow behind her, and tipped water to her lips. "Small sips," he murmured, surprised by how quickly his instincts rearranged themselves around 2 strangers. The driver arrived panting with a paper sack of medicine. Adrian signed without looking at the total and handed Lila the first tablets, reading the labels twice, confirming dosages the way he once double-checked dotted lines. Only when the fever's edge began to melt did he point, carefully, at the pendant Mira still held in a white-knuckled fist. "May I ask, that necklace, where did it come from?" Lila's eyes flicked to it, then to him, caution gathered on her brow. "It belonged to Mira's father," she said, each word chosen like a stepping stone over dark water. "It's the only thing he left." The bell inside him wouldn't stop ringing now. Old grief and newer shame tumbled like loose screws. He could have blurted the truth, could have said, "I know that clasp better than my own signature." But some part of him, the careful, contrite part, knew this conversation belonged to sober light and solid proof, not to a feverish room and a thunder of feelings. "I'm glad she kept it safe," he said, steadying his voice. "Would it be all right if I helped for a few days? Food, a doctor's follow-up, whatever you need." Lila studied him as if his face were a contract. Behind her guardedness was a tiredness so deep it looked like bone. "For Mira," she said at last, "yes." Outside, the city carried on with its indifferent miracles. Inside, a billionaire with every advantage on paper learned how heavy a small hand can feel when it chooses yours, and how a gold pendant can weigh more than a fortune when it threatens to unlock a past you aren't ready to see but can no longer avoid.
5 years earlier, when the city still felt like possibilities stitched together with bus fares and borrowed dresses, Lilo Osei woke before dawn to iron the oversized uniform she'd been given at Willow Crest Hotel. whispering a prayer over the hiss of steam that this job, this one, would hold. Naomi, her roommate and relentless cheerleader, clapped as Leela practiced greetings in the cracked mirror. "Good afternoon, welcome to Willowcrest," and pinned her hair with the precision of someone who'd been told too many times that neatness could masquerade as safety. The first week was a blur of room numbers, towel pyramids, and supervisors with polite smiles that hid scorecards. But on Friday, Naomi insisted they mark the tiny victory of a paycheck with something brighter than instant noodles. Tugging Leela toward the rooftop lounge that sat like a glass crown atop the same hotel they could barely afford to walk through. Leela hesitated. The headache blooming behind her eyes had been nagging all day, but Naomi pressed 2 tablets into her palm, just strong paracetamol, and dragged her into neon, music kicking like a second heartbeat, the city spread below like spilled constellations. They split a soda, laughed over nothing, and Leela promised herself she'd leave by 9, but dizziness began to nibble at the edges of things, softening outlines, tilting the floor a few degrees, so she slipped away from Naomi to find quiet. Down the corridor, a door sat half closed, a sliver of darkness beckoning. The plaque read, "Private Suite," but she told herself she would only sit for 5 minutes, just until the room stopped spinning, just until the nausea stopped trying to crawl up her throat. Inside it was cool and still, air-conditioned silence after the crowd, and the bed looked like a cloud that had learned discipline. She perched, then lay down, then let sleep take her in one unguarded swallow. At almost the same hour, in a boardroom 3 floors below, Adrian Cole stacked files like barricades and listened to an auditor outline the shape of betrayal. A childhood friend turned CFO had done something elegant and ugly with numbers, siphoning millions through shell companies with names that mocked trust, leaving Adrian to mop up headlines and explain gaps to a board that adored him until it was inconvenient. He shook the auditor's hand with the calm of someone taught not to bleed in public, walked to the lounge meaning to order club soda, and accepted whiskey because the bartender looked at him like a confession booth. 1 drink became 2, became forgetting exactly why he'd come, and when security, alerted by a protective assistant, materialized like efficient ghosts, they guided him to his suite with the gentle firmness reserved for valuable porcelain. He pushed the door open expecting emptiness and found her instead. Silhouette curled on the duvet, shoes neatly paired like evidence of respect, dress folded over a chair like a promise to herself that nothing here would be damaged. In the muddled compassion of grief and alcohol, he mistook her stillness for consent, hired by someone else's bad idea. Murmured a question he wouldn't remember, caught a whisper he might have invented. The night slid past with the soft inevitability of bad decisions that feel, for an hour, like refuge. Morning came with the cruelty of curtains that did nothing to block hard light, and he woke to a scattered memory, a hollow where his mother's pendant should have sat against his collarbone, and a meeting he was already late for. He scrubbed his face, told himself to find the chain later, and left a suite that smelled faintly of citrus and the ghost of someone he didn't look at long enough to memorize. Hours afterward, Leela jerked awake to the ache behind her eyes and the polite hush of a room that didn't belong to her. Shame and confusion arrived in the same breath, quickened by the gold glint on the pillow, heavy, warm, engraved with a crest and initials A.C. The clasp nicked exactly where someone's hands had once fumbled with love. She lifted it like proof that the night had been real, not a fever dream she'd invented to explain how small she felt. On the table sat an envelope with money she stared at as if it might bite. She took none of it, sliding only the pendant into her bag because part of her, stubborn, practical, knew that if she didn't carry something out of this room, she would walk into a month of pointing fingers with nothing to anchor her story. She found Naomi in the staff stairwell, began a sentence, lost 3 others, and let herself be led home through morning glare and buses that smelled like frying oil and effort. The week that followed was held together by to-do lists and denial until the nausea didn't leave, until a clinic's peeling paint framed a nurse's gentle voice saying "pregnant," until Leela's breath shortened and her hands found her flat stomach as if checking whether the word had weight. She walked back into the world changed but unspectacular, a single woman holding 2 lives, her own and the one she now promised to protect. And when neighbors' whispers started and the supervisor's patience thinned, and her body betrayed her with drowsiness at the worst times, she pressed through as if walking into rain you can't stop. At night, she turned the pendant in her fingers and whispered to a child the city couldn't see yet, "We'll know him by this." not realizing that the man who had lost it climbed into cars that sliced past her street every day, carrying an emptiness he couldn't name and a future already braided to hers.
By evening, the fever had eased to a stubborn glow, and the room had shifted from crisis to that fragile afterstate where every sound feels newly important, the kettle rattling on a one-burner stove, Mira humming to her doll, Adrian's phone buzzing unanswered on silent, as if money could wait its turn for once. So he made soup with whatever sat in Leela's cupboard, chopping onions like a man remembering he had hands for more than signatures. And when Mira announced solemnly that Daddy's necklace likes soup, both adults blinked at the word none of them had dared to test aloud. Adrian didn't correct her, didn't claim it, didn't flee it. He only ladled broth and said, "Good taste," as if the pendant could be a bridge they were learning to cross without looking down. When Leela's strength returned enough for stubbornness to reappear, she tried to send him home with thanks and a boundary. But he set the bowls aside and answered with a plan steadier than impulse. A private clinic first thing in the morning for a proper check, his driver on call to fetch whatever the doctor prescribed, groceries delivered because he'd noticed their shelf held more air than food, and, if she agreed, paperwork to start a paternity test done discreetly, but not secretly, because truth only heals when it can stand in daylight. No press, he promised when her jaw tightened at the word papers, no story shaped by anyone but us. If this proves what I think it will, we decide together how to tell it, or whether to tell it at all. She searched his face like a map for traps, and found only a man trying very hard to earn back a chance he hadn't known he'd squandered. She nodded once, the smallest treaty signed without pen or witness. He slept on his office couch that night, staring at the velvet-lined box where the pendant had lived, at the neat indentation like a missing tooth, and for the first time in 5 years the ache it triggered felt less like punishment and more like direction. At dawn he was back at Leela's door with coffee, porridge, and patience. The clinic smelled of lemon and old magazines. Mira collected cartoon stickers from a nurse who declared her bravery boardroom-worthy, and Leela endured tests with the quiet fortitude of someone who has spent years being her own paramedic. A pediatrician patched Mira's cheek, teased out a laugh, and told Adrian with the kind of kindness officials rarely use on him that some children do not need toys so much as time. He wrote it down mentally like a directive. Outside under a sour tamarind tree, he floated his second ask, careful as handling thin glass. The guest wing of his house, just for a few days, while Leela finished her meds and her energy returned. Separate entrance, no obligation, no strings. "I'm not trying to fold you into a life you didn't choose," he said, palms open. "I'm trying to keep you safe enough to choose anything." Leela chuckled once at his boardroom diction intruding on mercy, then surprised herself by saying 3 days, setting a limit like a railing she could grip. At the estate gate, the guard recognized Adrian and hesitated at Leela's thrift store bag, at Mira's scuffed shoes, at the pendant gleaming like provenance. Adrian nodded once, and the gate swung wide, the sort of deference that had always opened for him, and, for the first time, felt like it needed to be earned on behalf of someone else. He led them past paintings he no longer noticed, to a sunlit suite that smelled like laundry folded an hour ago, showed Mira the garden as if introducing her to a friend, and showed Leela the kitchen, because kitchens are where strangers become possible. He left them to rest and walked to his office, closed the door, and called his father, the only person who remembered his mother fastening that pendant the night she died. When the older man answered, Adrian said nothing for a beat, and then, very simply, "I think I found what I've been missing," which was not a confession so much as a recalibration. That evening he carried a tray upstairs, rice, stew, mango slices cut like suns, and found Mira constructing a fort from couch cushions and certainty, while Leela sat at the desk sorting the day into a calm she didn't feel. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll start the test." "And if it says no?" she asked, half daring him to flinch. "Then I'll be the friend who showed up when you needed one," he answered, discovering he meant it. Mira crawled out from the fort and pressed the pendant to his palm. "It says yes," she declared.
the kind of child logic that knows more than adults are willing to risk. For a suspended moment, all three of them looked at the glinting crest like sailors reading a star. Then the spell broke. Laughter arrived, awkward and bright, and the house, which had echoed with money for years, learned a new sound, belonging, tentative and real.
Night settled over the city like a held breath, and in the guest wing of Adrian's house the air felt so clean it made Leela self-conscious about every sound she made: the zipper of her old duffel, the sigh of worn fabric, the soft click when she checked the window latch twice, while Mira, electrified by novelty, padded barefoot across the plush rug and reported discoveries as if she were a field researcher. "Mommy, the bathroom light turns on by itself. Mommy, the bed is softer than clouds." And Adrian, 2 doors down in his office, moved through tasks with unusual slowness, drafting a message to his general counsel about confidential testing, texting his head of security to limit staff chatter, then stopping mid-sentence because he caught his reflection and realized he looked like a man trying to organize his way out of guilt. He closed the laptop and carried a tray upstairs instead, a peace offering of peppermint tea and honeyed crackers, and knocked as if he had no right to the door. Inside, Leela had already folded Mira into a cotton nightshirt and was teaching her that you can't bounce on every bed you meet, not even if it calls your name. She glanced at the tray, at him, at the soft smile he wore like a guest in his own home, and her features relaxed by a fraction, enough for him to set the cups on the table and pour without asking where the mugs lived. "You don't have to do all this," she murmured, though the way her fingers hovered near the steam betrayed how long it had been since someone else carried warmth toward her. "I know," he said, "but I get to." And the simplicity of that landed between them with a weight neither expected. When Mira finally slept, small hand fisted around a corner of the duvet like a sailor gripping rope, Leela and Adrian drifted to the threshold of conversation that feels like stepping onto a narrow bridge. Names, the short histories people give when the long ones are too tender. Jokes about the house being big enough to echo and the garden being big enough to get lost in. And then, reaching the edge of practicalities, he cleared his throat and told her the appointment time for the lab, the driver's name, the plan to stop for groceries after, and the promise that she could say no to anything, even kindness, if it grew teeth. She studied him not as a billionaire, not as a man who might be her child's father, but as a person arranging his words the way some men arranged roses, carefully, thorns hidden, intention visible, and she surprised herself by saying, "I believe you want to help," the closest she could come to a truce while her heart still carried cases against hope. Down the hall, Adrian stood a long time in the dark of his room, holding the emptiness at his collarbone like a measuring cup, then crossed to a walnut box and traced the velvet imprint where the pendant should have slept. And for the first time the missing did not accuse him. It beckoned. He set an alarm for dawn, failed to sleep, and when he finally did drift, it was to a memory of his mother's laugh, the chain slipping through her fingers like liquid sunlight. Morning came wrapped in birdsong and the civilized hiss of espresso from a machine that cost more than Leela's old rent. She woke before Mira, listening to a house that made no demands, and for a moment panic rose. Rooms this quiet felt like a trap, until she heard Adrian in the kitchen humming off-key, and the panic melted into the more manageable discomfort of being cared for. Over toast that crunched like a promise kept, they mapped the day. Mira dunked her slice in tea because she had decided treaties are tastier when soggy, and Leela didn't stop her because childhood had been lean on treaties lately. At the gate, a guard tipped his cap to Mira as if she were royalty disguised in a thrift store hoodie, and Mira tipped back solemnly the way children do when they understand ceremony without knowing the word.
The car slid into traffic. The city unfurled, and Leela watched neighborhoods flicker past like old chapters, while Adrian watched their reflections in the window and practiced the discipline of not reaching for answers before the test could speak. "Are you scared?" he asked, soft enough that she could ignore it. "I'm tired," she said, which in her language meant yes, and also, "I'll keep going." He nodded, which in his meant, "I heard you, and I'll stay."
The lab hummed with a low, expensive quiet, the kind that made people whisper even when no one asked them to, and Leela sat with her hands folded over her knee while Mira swung her feet, counting ceiling tiles under her breath, and Adrian filled out forms with a lawyer's neatness that trembled only when a line required his signature next to "alleged father." A nurse with smile lines offered Mira a sticker the size of a saucer and explained cheek swabs like a magic trick. And when the cotton tip brushed inside Mira's mouth, she giggled, "It tickles!" And Leela's shoulders loosened a notch as if the room had agreed not to hurt what she loved most. Adrian went next, jaw set, eyes steady, and Leela followed, surprised by the intimacy of a stranger asking her to open her mouth for certainty, how proof could be so simple after years of complexity. And when it was done, the nurse promised a turnaround swift but not instant, a phrase that landed like a small test of patience none of them had studied for. Outside, the morning had sharpened into sunlight, the kind that turns dust into glitter, and they crossed the parking lot as if stepping back onto a chessboard, each square a decision. "I'd like to drive you home," Adrian said, not to reclaim so much as to return, and Leela nodded because there were things to collect, documents tucked into a cookbook, Mira shoe forms under a flowered cloth, the shawl her grandmother had given her, and because part of healing is saying goodbye to the rooms that held your worst nights. The neighborhood received the black sedan with the curiosity of a theater audience spotting a cameo, but no one called out, and Leela was grateful for mercies at this scale. Inside her flat, the air held the soft perfume of yesterday's stew and the stubborn scent of effort. She moved through the single room with a practiced economy, sifting what mattered from what had merely survived. Mira's chipped mug with painted stars, the faded poster of planets above the bed, 2 pairs of shoes that fit today. And Adrian stood in the doorway as if asking permission simply to witness the museum of their making, eyes catching on the calendar with unpaid circles, on the taped crack in the mirror, on a drawing of a gold necklace that Mira had colored like sunlight. "You can keep the lease," he said, voice low. "I'll cover it for now. No conditions, no relocation you haven't chosen. I don't want generosity to feel like eviction." And Leela turned at that, met a kind of carefulness she recognized as rare, and answered with a truth that felt like removing a splinter. "I need a place that belongs to us, even if the door is sometimes shut." And he nodded, reflexively offering to change the code on his guest wing so it read like a welcome instead of a favor. Back at the estate, the gate lifted without drama, and Mira, drowsy from the day's seriousness, fell asleep against Leela's side, the pendant gleaming at her throat in a small, declarative sun. Adrian carried the grocery bags himself, restocked the fridge with an earnestness that bordered on apology. Milk, fruit, bread, a riot of vegetables, as if color itself were nourishing. And then, after a pause that asked for consent, made a call to his father. Chairman Cole arrived in the afternoon, dressed like old certainty, cane clicking on marble, eyes moving with a tactician's speed to the guest wing, to Leela, to Mira, who woke and stared at him as if trying to place a story she'd heard in a different voice. Adrian said very little, only that they were waiting for tests, and that he hoped, if things were as they seemed, to do this with honor. And the older man, who had loved Adrian's mother with the kind of ferocity that makes heirlooms into talismans, looked at the pendant, and then at Mira, and then at Leela's steady posture, and surprised them both by thanking Leela for protecting a child he did not yet have the right to claim. When he left, the house settled into the practical rhythm of a 3-person evening. Homework pages printed from the office computer, Mira's drawings magneted to a fridge that had only ever displayed catered menus, pasta boiled until it forgot to be al dente, laughter and small, startled bursts like birds testing air after rain.
Later, when Mira slept and the day stopped clamoring, Leela and Adrian stood by the window watching the city sow itself to night. "Whatever the results say," he offered, "we'll decide next steps together. If I'm her father, I will be present and predictable, and if something unexpected appears, I will still be present and predictable in the ways you'll let me." And Leela, who had taught herself to distrust future tense, found that the promise sounded less like a pitch and more like a plan with room for her veto. She unfastened the pendant to polish it with the hem of her shirt, then paused and held it up between them. The chain caught lamplight and made a small moving ring on the ceiling like a planet's halo. "It used to be proof," she said, almost to herself. "Now it feels like a question." And Adrian, whose life had been reduced to answers for too long, said, "Maybe it can be both until we're ready to make it a promise." And for once, the silence that followed felt like sanctuary rather than emptiness.
The next day unfolded like a test of small promises kept. Adrian rescheduled 2 board calls without apology and took Mira to school himself in a sedan that suddenly felt less like status and more like responsibility. Crouching at the gate while she straightened her thrift store headband with the grave focus of a pilot, then returning to the house with paper bags that rustled like competence. Oats, lentils, bananas, the cereal with the cartoon astronaut Mira had admired in the clinic waiting room, while Leela, still wary of ease, moved through the kitchen with sleeves rolled in the quiet certainty of someone who knows how to stretch a meal into dignity. They were halfway through an awkward dance of chores, he insisting on washing, she insisting she wasn't a guest, when the front bell rang in a staccato that announced expectation rather than request. Celine stepped in on a tide of perfume and polished vowels, sunglasses like shutters, voice bright with claim. "You changed the gate code," she said, which wasn't a question. Her gaze skated across the fruit bowl, the second mug, the small pink backpack on a chair, and landed on Lilo with an assessment that could have been engraved. "Not from here." Adrian didn't gesture for her to sit. Instead, he stood between the island and the door, posture courteous and immovable. "We're waiting on test results," he said evenly, before Celine could script the scene into gossip. "In the meantime, Leela and her daughter are under my roof as my guests." Celine's smile thinned into geometry. "Guests don't rearrange a man's life." Leela's hand paused over the dish towel, then lowered. She didn't argue, didn't bow. She simply looked at Adrian to see whether the house would teach her what it did to women who refused to shrink. He answered her without turning his head. "My life needed rearranging," he said, surprising even himself with the relief of truth. Celine tried a new tactic, the rapid calculus of someone who has never had to carry a bill alone. "We should talk privately," she murmured, stepping closer, "about the announcement, the spring gala, the foundation's donor list, things that can still be salvaged if you aren't busy playing benefactor." The last word sparkled with acid. Adrian felt the old performance tug at him, press release, damage control, the choreography of appearing untouchable. But he let it pass. "There won't be an announcement," he said, "until there's a fact. And when there is, I'll defend it in daylight." Celine's eyes flicked to the necklace resting at the hollow of Mira's absent throat on a hook by the door, to the faint smudge of crayon on Adrian's cuff, to the unignorable evidence that something was already shifting in a way Couture couldn't outtalk. "You've made your choice," she said, breath tight. And if it sounded like accusation, it also sounded like recognition. She left with her silhouette intact and her story suddenly less so. The kitchen exhaled. Leela didn't thank him. Gratitude, she'd learned, can become a leash. But she set a bowl in front of him, sliding over a spoon like an agreement renewed. After lunch, Adrian walked her through the documents his counsel had drafted, in plain language, temporary support with no strings that could tangle, a mutual non-disclosure limited to medical process, not truth, an outline for co-parenting that emphasized Mira's routine over anyone's reputation.
"These are proposals," he said, tapping each page. "Not pressure. You get edits, vetoes, pauses." Leela read line by line, jaw unclenching with each clause that respected her agency, and made 2 changes that turned accommodation into partnership. Her flat would remain her legal residence for now, and any introduction of Mira to public events would require both signatures and 2 weeks' notice. "Non-negotiable," she added softly. "Done," he said, relieved to have something he could do impeccably well. In the late afternoon, Chairman Cole returned with a chess set and the kind of grandfatherly pretext that allowed him to memorize a child without staring. He taught Mira how a knight moves in L's, and between moves, told a story about Adrian's mother that left the room gentler around the edges. As dusk deepened, the house discovered new rituals. Mira demonstrated her astronaut crunch cereal while lecturing the bowl about lunar gravity. Leela annotated the co-parenting document with neat check marks. Adrian burned a tray of roasted carrots and was applauded anyway because he tried again without sulking. When bedtime came, Mira asked whether stars were holes poked in the dark to let heaven breathe. And Adrian, sitting at the foot of the guest bed, like a permanent visitor to the most important meeting of his life, said he liked her theory better than his. Leela watched him from the doorway, fingers resting against the doorframe as if measuring thresholds, and when their eyes met, neither spoke apology or promise. They exchanged something sturdier, a recognition that what they were building would have to be banal and brave at once, a scaffolding of breakfasts and school forms and hard conversations that no headline could carry. Later, alone on the balcony, the city buzzing like circuitry below, Adrian stared at the skyline and felt the familiar magnetic pull of control loosen, replaced by a quieter gravity, the weight of a small hand that had chosen his, the ring of a pendant that no longer felt like proof or question, but like a bell calling him finally to show up.
Morning broke with the soft insistence of a doorbell. First a polite ping, then a second, then the long press that announces impatience, and before anyone reached the foyer, the house monitors flashed a knot of cameras at the gate, lenses like insects clinging to iron. Someone had whispered to the tabloids that a mystery child had been seen entering the Cole estate, and the rumor, greased by envy and internet oxygen, arrived faster than any lab result ever could. Adrian met security in the hall already buttoning his cuffs, issued the kind of orders that sounded like boundaries rather than bluster. No comments, no shots over the fence, call the precinct liaison. Offer water to the 2 freelancers he recognized, who never took cheap bait, and then turn to the harder work, walking into the kitchen to find Leela frozen mid-stir at the sight of strangers through the hedges, and Mira asking in a hush if the people outside were lost. "They're noisy neighbors," he said lightly, hating the euphemism and choosing it anyway. "And I'm going to ask them to be quiet." Leela's shoulders were tight as wire. "I won't have her photographed without consent," she said, voice low and unyielding. "You won't," he answered, and because words were thin when sharpened against fear, he showed her the plan, not just the promise, blinds drawn on the street side, a temporary privacy screen weaved through laurel, a pre-drafted statement that said nothing salacious and everything necessary. "We are assisting friends. A child's welfare is not a headline. Please respect their privacy while we complete a legal process." Plus a courier already en route to the lab to check whether swift but not instant could slide a little closer to today. Inside, ordinary life stubbornly continued its lesson plan. Mira's spelling list, necklace, planet, courage. Toast that popped like applause. Chairman Cole arriving with an old leather satchel of photo albums under the pretense of consulting on a family archive, his cane clicking out a tempo that steadied the air. At the kitchen table he opened to a page where a younger Adrian,
ate and gap-toothed, wore the pendant too big on his chest, while his mother laughed behind him, the chain pooling like sunlight in her palm. Mira studied the picture, and then the man, and then the pendant hanging at her own throat, drawing an invisible line only children and mathematicians do cleanly. Lila watched the exchange like someone witnessing the reveal in a magic trick she hadn't asked to see and couldn't deny. Before lunch, the first testing update arrived. The samples were processing ahead of schedule, results likely by early evening. The news loosened something in Adrian he hadn't noticed he held clenched, and tightened something in Lila she had learned to keep taut. Hope, that treacherous elastic. And then the house tested its seams in another way. Celine returned, not at the door, but through the side entrance she'd used for parties and strategies, and intercepted a housekeeper in the hall with the effortless entitlement of someone who confuses familiarity with jurisdiction. "We'll relocate the guests to the cottage," she said, as if moving chess pieces. "This wing is visible from the road." The housekeeper glanced toward Lila's half-open door in mute appeal, just as Adrian turned the corner, eyes cooling. "No," he said, calm as the cut of a blade. "We won't." Celine's smile trembled, then hardened. "I'm protecting you." "Protecting me has never required diminishing anyone else," he replied. And then, because this was a house, not a stage, he asked her to walk with him to the study, where he closed the door and ended whatever ambiguity remained, with courtesy, with finality, with a truth that did not need an audience. The relationship he'd sustained on momentum had no room in the life he was building on purpose. When she left, she didn't slam a door. She exhaled a history and carried its echo down the drive. Afternoon sagged hot and bright. In the garden, Mira chased shadows while Lila stood with a glass of water, still as a landmark, and Adrian joined her with a slowness that asked permission to occupy this ordinary square of day. "Does it always feel like this?" she asked, without looking at him. "Like the world has opinions about rooms they've never stood in?" "Only until you stop letting them in," he said, and pointed at the screen going up along the laurel, a literal line drawn against intrusion. A thud and a small cry snapped them both around. Mira had tripped on a sprinkler head and scraped her knee. And Lila moved first, then Adrian, then both at once, the choreography of new co-parents who haven't practiced and still somehow arrived together. After the sting-clean hug sequence, Mira sniffed, heroic. "It will make a cool scar," Adrian said gravely. "Scars are maps of brave." Lila met his eyes over the top of their child's head, hers always, his maybe, surprised by the ease of the sentence landing between them like a plank added to a growing bridge. Near dusk, the courier called, envelope in hand, ETA 12 minutes. The house held its breath, not with fear now, but with readiness, the hush that comes before a verdict that is also a beginning.
The envelope arrived without fanfare, white, unassuming, stamped with the lab's austere logo, and for a heartbeat no one moved, as if the paper itself radiated a temperature the room wasn't ready to endure. Adrian took it because Lila's hands had gone still and careful in the way a surgeon steadies before an incision, and Mira, perched on a kitchen stool swinging her legs, announced matter-of-factly that letters are slower than truth, which loosened a thin smile from all three adults present. He broke the seal with his thumb, slid out the single page that had the power to rename their days, and read first with his eyes, then again with his breath, then a third time with the muscle that had been clenched behind his ribs for 5 years. When he looked up, he didn't reach for a speech or a camera or even the nearest chair. He reached for Lila's gaze. "Yes," he said, the word landing like a key in the right lock. "It's conclusive. I'm Mira's father." The house seemed to expand around the syllables.
Leela exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh, something ragged and relieved, and her shoulders, those coat hangers for too many burdens, dropped an inch. Mira studied both faces with a scientist's curiosity, then tapped the pendant at her throat and declared, with the clean logic of children, "I told you." Adrian crouched to her height, the page shaking a little in his hand because certainty, it turns out, is heavier than doubt, and said, "You did," before pulling her into a hug that felt like stepping into weather he'd been built for all along. Chairman Cole, who had waited in the next room to give this moment as few witnesses as possible, appeared at the threshold and didn't pretend not to wipe his eye. He thanked Leela again, not performatively, not because the script demanded it, but because gratitude is a form of recognition, and asked if he might show Mira one photograph, which he did. Adrian at 5, face smeared with frosting, the pendant bright against a paper crown. Practicalities followed because life insists. Adrian called his counsel and said 3 words he rarely used: slow, be human, then dictated the first draft of a joint statement that turned spectacle into boundary. We have received private results concerning a private family matter. Our priority is a child's safety and stability. We ask for privacy and will share nothing further. Leela read it, red-penned one line, removing any phrase that felt like ownership rather than partnership, and nodded. They signed the co-parenting framework that evening at the kitchen table with lemonade sweating on coasters and a basket of crayons standing in for a notary. The document still smelled like printer ink when Mira demanded a celebratory movie under a quilt fort, and Adrian burned a second tray of carrots attempting redemption. Outside the gate, a few cameras still clocked their vigil, but the statement went out and the screens rose, and more importantly, the house learned its new choreography. Who takes the left side of the hallway when carrying laundry? Which drawer gets Band-Aids? How to label the calendar with both routines and mercy? Mira's school assembly, Leela's shift at the cafe she insisted on keeping until she decided otherwise. Adrian's board meeting moved, not canceled. Later, on the garden steps, Leela said the truest thing she could manage in a day that had asked her to believe many. "I don't want my life swept up and renamed without me." And Adrian answered, "Then help me name it right," and offered not a ring or a headline, but a schedule. Mornings he'd handle drop-off, alternating weekends, a fund in Mira's name with Leela as co-signer, therapy for all 3 if and when, a promise to introduce any future relationship slowly, respectfully, and only with mutual consent. He called Celine not to reopen or salve, but to be clean. She listened, brittle as spun sugar, said she expected as much, and declined grace without taking cruelty, which is its own kind of ending. Near bedtime, Mira asked whether her last name had to change tonight like pajamas, and Leela kissed her forehead and said, "Names are houses, and you get to live in them for a while. We'll paint the doors together." Adrian added that her school forms could wait until she decided what felt like home on her tongue. Mira tested Mira Ose Cole and Mira Cole Ose and giggled at the way the hyphen felt like a tiny bridge she could run across. When the lights were out and the house returned to its low companionable hum, Adrian stepped into his office and opened the old walnut box out of reflex. The velvet slot looked less like a wound and more like a story that had reached its missing chapter. He didn't put the pendant back. He left it where it belonged on a sleeping child's chest and returned to the balcony where Leela stood with her arms folded for warmth, not distance. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll tell her class I'm the one who makes bad carrots and better pancakes." And Leela, smiling into the dark, said, "And I'll tell them we're all learning," which was apology and benediction for the mess behind them and the map ahead.
On Monday, the house woke naturally, not to headlines or doorbells, but to the ordinary percussion of a life being built. Mira's spelling practice on one leg,
espresso's hiss answering a kettle's whistle, Adrian's mutter as he tied a ribbon around a lunchbox, and Leela, who had trained herself to expect the ground to shift, noticed that it held. They moved through a new choreography with care. He cleaned the skillet without being asked. She circled the calendar and added mercies. Chairman Cole arrived with a toolbox to fix a hinge and stayed for pancakes. At school drop-off, Adrian told the teacher, "I'm Adrian, Mira's dad. We're new at this and open to guidance." And the teacher wrote both numbers on a star-shaped note. The paparazzi had thinned to a few tired lenses, and when one called a question, Mira answered first, "We're busy." The photo that surfaced showed a little girl in a thrift store hoodie holding two hands. Leela returned to the cafe for a final week to hand over shifts, and Adrian became a customer who tipped in cash. He drafted a press policy that forbade using a child to sell a headline and learned the names of every guard on the school rotation. Evenings were the glue. Homework into rocket diagrams, pasta into edible math, carrots into a running joke. When he finally served a tray that wasn't burnt, Mira banged her spoon like a bell and knighted him Sir Almost. The co-parenting plan proved itself in tiny frictions where promises live or die. A scheduling overlap solved by Leela's neighbor while Adrian raced from a board vote. A bedtime mix-up fixed with a shared note. A flare of pride cooled by a text that began with, "I hear you." On Friday, the foundation gala arrived like weather they chose not to stand in. Adrian sent regrets and a donation, cited a family night, and meant it, because the only glitter they needed was Mira's sticker constellation on the hall. After dinner, Chairman Cole opened albums and let stories do the lifting. Adrian at 8 conducting an imaginary orchestra, his mother threading the pendant through his fingers and saying, "Gold remembers warmth." Mira fell asleep halfway through, and Leela carried her to bed, pausing when she realized the future had quietly taken a seat. On Saturday, they visited Leela's flat to water the fern, pick up mail, and remind the rooms they were still part of the circle. Adrian repaired a loose socket, and Leela filed the lease in a folder labeled Ours. By Sunday, the house had a ritual. Pancakes, garden, chess, a walk where no one talked about legacy because the neighbor's dog demanded admiration. When the first custody review appeared, they drove together, sat together, and spoke one at a time. The judge signed orders that mirrored the plan they kept. Outside on the steps, Adrian extended his hand, not for a shake, but for a promise renewed. "We'll keep choosing the unglamorous thing," he said. "The true thing," Leela answered. That night, on the balcony, city lights knitting into constellations, she unfastened the pendant from Mira's sleeping neck and pressed it into Adrian's palm. It began as proof, then a question, then a bell. Let it be a reminder. He didn't return it to the velvet slot. He put it in a shallow dish by the door, where keys and crayons lived, an altar to the daily. The conclusion wasn't a trumpet or a ring. It was a table set for 3 and a calendar scrawled with ordinary nouns. Dentist, recital, soup. Love, they learned, doesn't fix the past or promise a painless map. It chooses, again and again, to show up with clean dishes and clear words, to tell the truth before the rumor, to hold a child's hand until the sidewalk ends. And the moral is simple. The lives we are given rarely match the lives we planned, but the lives we build, with patience, boundaries, and the courage to be decent, can be better. Sometimes the missing piece is a person you haven't learned to be yet, and sometimes it's a small voice saying, "I told you," jangling a gold sun that no longer has to prove anything at all.